Good afternoon, everybody. This is Vivek Joshi, your host of the Aftermarket Champions podcast. I'm excited to bring today to you a different guest from most of the people I've introduced on this show before. And I say different because he is the only one who I've got here who has been an alum from the same business school as I did. And that's kind of how we met each other. So, welcome, Andrew Syzek from ATS Automation. Andrew's based in Charlotte. ATS is a global company with operations worldwide. I'm going to let Andrew describe to all of us a little bit about his company. But more importantly, Andrew, first, welcome to the show. And B, I'd love to hear a little bit about your story and how a Darden alum like you wound up in service like me, which is like when we first met, I mentioned we're the odd ducks here a little bit. So help me
Sure.
understand that story a little bit.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, and I've appreciated all of our conversations up to date. So, yeah, the highlights here, I think, of how I got into service, right? Like you said, I went to Darden Business School after I spent some time in the Army. It's a good school for veterans and a good spot to transition, but certainly didn't go in knowing what I wanted to do afterwards, right? So learned a lot while at Virginia. And found some companies that I really liked. One of them stuck out was Danaher. So I spent some time in the Danaher rotational program. Go through different functions, different businesses, learn as much as you can, with the idea to lead a business, right? Whatever that business is. What I really didn't know at the time is service can be a business as well, and nor at that time did I know that's what I wanted to get into. So. Saw a lot of things at Danaher, a lot of different operating companies within their portfolio, a lot of different functions. But the last one I kind of stopped on at Danaher was more in service, right? So launching products, but really heavy on the how do you support a big piece of equipment? Right? Building a plan to launch a product in a new region. You really have to look at what customers think about, what keeps their machine running, what it means to them. And so that's kind of the first time I really tried to understand service. And from there, it stuck. From there, it was expanding different parts of service, whether that's figuring out ways for people to send equipment into you by mail more efficiently so you can get them up and running quicker. And I liked how it became problem solving.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So I kind of planted my flag in service. After Danaher, went with some former Danaher folks and small stint in private equity running a service business. Learned even more there. And then, ran an aftermarket business at an appliance company. A little less on the service side, but a whole lot on the consumer experience side. How stickiness, aftermarket can really drive value in a number of ways. So all those things, but ultimately led to ATS, which is where I am now. And I look after the service businesses of a collection of our food and beverage and packaging companies within the ATS portfolio. So more B2B than I've had in a couple prior roles, but still love it every day. And service, I think, is an interesting part of every business I've been in. So.
What you said is actually, there's a couple of things that stood out for me. One is, by definition, almost, you've been around manufacturing the entire time you've been out of business school. And I can promise you that when I left business school a couple of years before you, there were very few people like me who went to manufacturing. Was that similar for you as well? Were you one of the really small minority of business school students from our alma mater, Darden, who went into manufacturing companies?
I don't know if it'd be the minority. Danaher and companies like that have a big presence on campus. And then, once you get into those companies, how close you are to the plant floor differs.
Right.
So your experience differs when you get there.
Right.
But it still had a good kind of general management, some of it pretty manufacturing heavy coming from Darden.
The shift to service was interesting because you had this doing a rotation program. You wound up in the service aspect, and you started developing a liking for it. Are there aspects of service that you think kind of helped you, synthesize a lot of your learnings from not just the business school, but the military and everything like that. Is there something that kind of resonated with you when you wound up in services?
Yeah, I think what resonated with me is within service, you have an outsized impact on the customer experience and really the financials of a business. Um, just because of the experience you can create, hopefully, and if you don't do it well, destroy. And so I think that really resonated with me, and of course you see things like that in the army and in business school. Um, if of the experience means everything for the long term relationships, right? How you grow the business, how you grow stickiness with repeat customers. Yeah, I think that kind of resonated at a number of different stops to get here.
So one more follow-up question to that, right? So you could have easily done that service rotation and then say, that's fine, I'm going to go be a strategic planner somewhere, or you could have been a marketing or salesperson somewhere. Why have you stuck with service for the last, I mean, it's more than a decade now, right? I mean, quite well more than a decade now, right? That's a pretty remarkable longevity in this function, for lack of a better term. Even though there was an appliance company in between or whatever, right? Still
Yep.
fundamentally around supporting existing customers.
Yeah, I think I stuck with it, and what I like about it is there's always room for growth, right? Where the companies I've been at, where they are in kind of their maturity scale, and how they view service and how mature they are in their offerings, it's different. But at some point, there's always room to grow. There's always room to shift the business, um, and you can have significant value just because we all know that there's higher margin things like parts and SaaS and those types of offerings, um, and you can start to write the playbook. Right, there's a lot of learning out there. People are trying things, um, and so I think there's a lot of room to grow and serve your customers in ways they haven't been served before. That to me is always fun.
One of the things you said a few minutes ago was that this notion of experience matters a lot, and experience to the life cycle is something that I've been paying a lot of maybe attention to is the wrong word, but thinking a lot about it recently. Have you, as you've gone through the Danners of the world, the private equity owned company, the appliance company, and now ATS, how have those experiences, the wrong word, how have those learnings effectively crystallized your thinking about experience and life cycle and, dealing with customers over the life of the asset for lack, for the way to kind of create value? How has that manifested itself in your uh, job today, I guess?
Yeah, and I could take different parts from each of those stops on the
Yeah.
journey and apply it. So when I look at the appliance company, and I was responsible for the consumables.
Mm.
So when you buy a refrigerator, all the water filters and things that come with it, you could boil some of that down to some wow moments. Right? In that
Hmm.
case, it's more of maybe an unboxing, how easy it is to subscribe on kind of a consumer level. But you get these moments, right? And you really have to overserve your customer at those special moments to drive loyalty. That applies to appliances. That applies to industrial manufacturing, where something breaks. Right? How does that experience go for them? You have an opportunity to overserve a customer, fix their problem, get them back up and running. I think that applies in the aftermarket and all these different industries.
Yeah.
So I think seeing the life cycle of equipment, it's a series of these moments, right? And when you start to get to um, more advanced, more proactive life cycle management, you engage in between those moments. You don't just want it to be break fix. That's a big important part of it. But how are you checking in, making sure their machines are running the way you want them to, the way they're supposed to run, right? Throughout the life cycle of whatever that piece of equipment is. Um, so yeah, I think there's huge importance to life cycle management because one of the things we always say, the companies I've been is sales sells the first one and then service sells the rest, right? So that experience has an outsized impact again.
Yeah. But I'm going to pick on that last sentence you just said, right? Sales sells the first, and the service sells the rest. I'll be a provocative questioner here for a second, right? you and I obviously vehemently agree with that statement. However, comma, I've not seen that as broadly, not expressed, but not broadly practiced, if you may, in the world around us. I mean, you've been around not just a few companies in their career, but you watch enough people around you, right? Why do you think that is a case where when it's so obvious that you have a one and done with the sales of the equipment and many through the life, the, the realization or the manifestation doesn't come through as well as it should?
Yeah, I think, different company to company, but the focus from senior leadership, collaboration amongst functions, whatever those are, and treating and empowering aftermarket business units as a business unit and a very important one. And it comes down to whether or not the various companies treat it that way, right? Because it is a business unit, it is cross collaboration. Rarely do we get customer issues and it's just one department, right? Things can be cross functional, requires all hands on deck. Um, so it's like any function where you just have to collaborate across the business. And I think a lot of that starts with, champions, right? Champions for the aftermarket, be it senior leadership or just the various functional leaders.
Yeah. Now, what's interesting to me is when I first met you and when I started talking to you about some of these things, it's a realization that I had is that people like you and me, like I described in the introduction, were odd ducks in the world of people coming from the background we did and wound up where we are today. If I were to ask you to just think about what you just said in terms of collaboration and realization of the importance of the value of this function. Now, again, I did my MBA a little bit before you did, but I don't ever recall having this discussion in any of my classes. It is very much functionally oriented about finance and marketing and operations and HR and whatever, but there was never any explicit tie to what you just talked about. Is that one of the things that needs to get fixed, or is that just that's only one passing element of it? You know what I'm saying? I don't remember having any service related classes in school.
Yeah, it doesn't. I would sure love a couple more cases on service businesses,
Yeah,
but it doesn't have to be just service, right? It's more about how do you collaborate across functions, whether you're
right,
part of marketing, sales, whatever it is. The more you can learn that, I think the more effective you'll be. But that's also hard to learn via case, right? That's living in the trenches in whatever function you're in and whatever role you're in, and learning how to do that. So I think uh, more service cases would be great, but really getting your hands dirty, living tactically in a couple functions will teach you how to collaborate.
right. No, that's a fair point, and I think we've all had these situations where we've been taught in class about what to do, but unless you wind up in a cross-functional, multi-agenda group, you won't know how to kind of navigate this thing, right? I
Yep.
actually, I actually describe services as the ultimate team sport, right? And the reason I call it a team sport is almost every function within the company has a vested interest or a say in how service happens and gets delivered, right? If you think about it, the manufacturing people have built the product with a certain bill of materials and have certain information about it. The engineering team has built the components and the reliability into it. The reliability engineering does something, your field service does something, and sales, as you said, one and done. They sell it for a particular spec. Yeah, you may or may not function to that spec, right? But that team game really is something that is is probably the one place where I think everything comes together in a manufacturing company like ATS and where I've grown up. Does that sound right to you, or am I kind of extending that cross-functional analogy too far?
Nope, nope. I think you got it. I mean, it should be in every aspect, whether you're designing for serviceability on a new machine, right? How easy are you designing it to change out a part so you don't keep the customer down or frustrated, all the way to when you get an order for a routine order for a spare part, right? Sure, someone's taking that order. They're probably in the service department, but you have supply chain logistics. You've got a whole bunch of other people who need help to make that work. So it does go cross functional in pretty much everything it does. It's just the impact of that cross functional teamwork. I mean, that's where the customer feels it, and it's usually the service department who hears the most
Right.
of how that service and experience went.
Right. Now, what I would ask you is a slightly different take on that last part, which is service is the one that feels it and probably gets the impact the most in terms of dissatisfied customer calls and visits and so on and so forth. You know, remember this title of this podcast is Aftermarket Champions, right? So if I were to ask you the question slightly different, it's like, Andrew, have you seen or have you heard of other people who do this really well and quote unquote become aftermarket champions because of this collaboration slash team sport mindset? And if so, what makes them stand out, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, seen plenty of aftermarket champions, both at companies I work for and ones that I've observed. And so I think about it in two parts. You've got the aftermarket champion who has something service related in their title. Right? You're a VP of service, you're a service manager, whatever it is. But then the second part is the aftermarket champions who are the senior leaders. Right? They can also champion service in a different way. You kind of need both of those to work together to really set yourself apart.
Yeah.
And so for the people who are living service every day, what I've seen that really sets them apart who do it well is they know how to strike that balance of tactical and strategic.
Mm-hmm.
There's times when you just have to roll up your sleeves and solve customer issues. There's service, there's plenty of problems and challenges. So they can do that, know when that's required, but then also know when to step back and say, hey, we're getting too many of those types of complaints. How do I build a process, a tool, data, so I can avoid this in the future?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you got to split that tactical and strategic. And I think those who know how to balance that well, those are the ones who drive the business forward versus just fighting fires throughout the life of the machine. So I think that's a big one. And then the ones who really understand how to make things easier, not just for customers, but for their employees. Right? If you're not making things easier, more effective for the people taking orders, the service technicians, the engineers, it's hard to make things stick. So I think really understanding what it entails to be in those roles, right? To go on the ride-alongs, to see what people do, what takes the most time, what are their pain points. They have a good way of addressing those, and I think those are kind of the biggest key ones to go after. But organizationally, I think the aftermarket champions who they champion service in the organization. If they're on the senior leadership team, they're the outspoken advocate for the customer and for service. They're right next to the head of sales and the head of engineering at the table and the leadership team, and they speak on behalf of the customer. I think that's something that I think really will start to set them apart. And not all aftermarket organizations are set up that way.
Yeah.
And so that's where I think that second part comes into play with the senior leaders. If you want to focus on aftermarket, you got to set it up that way. You got to empower the leaders. You got to get them in the right position so that they can be that champion. All right. So that I kind of look at it in those two ways.
Yeah. No, I think you said something important, which is I've always thought that a strong leader has what I would call dynamic range, both strategic and tactical kind of ability to kind of get things done. I think you also mentioned something that's important, which is the way you build credibility is to deliver results, right?
Yep.
And if you deliver results, you get credibility with the management team around you and your superiors, which is the CEO in this case, right? And being able to deliver that is something that's basically almost like a given if you think about rising in the organization. Now, it brings me to a very maybe controversial question is, you've had a path starting with the military, the general management training, and then you like service and stayed in service. Presumably as you advance in your career, delivery of results, reliability of execution matters a lot. But then does it give you an opportunity to leapfrog into other leadership roles? Or do you think that in today's business construct, you will be labeled as an aftermarket and services leader all the time? I think those are, it doesn't mean you can't rise in that hierarchy, but can you not make the move into a broader, you know, leadership role, the business leadership role or CEO role or something like that, right?
Yeah,
You know what I'm saying?
I do, and it's a good point, and I think it is absolutely possible to move up into more senior roles in your organization if you deliver and you balance the tactical and strategic. If you're heavy on the technical and you're just that service manager, and that's what you like, you're probably going to stay there, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think there's a time now that senior leaders have service experience because of how close it is to customers, because you know what customers care about, and you hear about it a lot. So I think that background really does make good senior leaders. Certainly, some of the ones that I've worked for,
Yeah.
I've been lucky to work for them, and a lot of them do have service experience in various forms.
I think that's to me is going to be the breakthrough, right? So we are fortunate in that, and a brief thing about entitled. Many of our customers are people like you who are forward-thinking leaders who are running a big P&L and have actually done extremely well in terms of how they delivered results and how they built the business. And as a result, many of them have got promoted out of services, which actually fascinated to me, right? And they're doing exactly what you said, which is they're taking this mindset of customer and customer experience and service into quote unquote the mainline business, which is equipment making and selling, which I think is fabulous because without that cross pollination, none of this making service important is going to kind of matter, right? And I think that's what I'd love to see. So that's kind of
Yeah,
my.
I agree. I love, I would say, exporting talent right internally to other roles, leadership roles within the business. Once you know how important service is, I think spreading the people who have worked in service is great. It can only expand our mission, right, and help people prioritize service. Yep.
So one slightly different question, if you don't mind, going away from this career progression and thought process around career and services. When you look at your background, you've been in large companies like Danaher, and ATS is a reasonably large company, maybe not as big as Danaher, maybe a couple of smaller private equity owned and other companies. Are there common themes that stand out to you in the experiences as it relates to how large and small companies think about services or aftermarket, or is it very different for each situation is different enough where there's no commonality or no common thought process across?
Yeah, I think there's certainly commonalities. Now, I've worked with directly or with former colleagues of Danaher a lot, right? So my view is somewhat similar in some of the companies I've been at, but regardless of ownership structure of the company, right? So the thing that's common is it's a staircase. It's a maturity journey in service, and some of them start at step one where you're just taking parts orders. Some of them are on the more advanced side with predictive maintenance and things like that. But the staircase is the same, right? And where we start is very different, but that staircase is the same. And the other part to it is when leaders realize that service is a priority and they start to put focus on it, and you start to move up that staircase, it does start to have an outsized impact, both on the business financials, but also on the customer experience. So that's common. That applies no matter which business I've looked at or been a part of. And then I think the other thing that's common is, the how important the change management piece is to moving up that staircase. You don't just get to go from A to C, right? The change management is something that you have to pay a lot of attention to. Service has been around doing one thing for a long time. So really paying attention to that change management part of the journey, that's where you get wins, right? That's where you start to have the impact that you want. So the businesses I've been in is, don't underestimate that, and that's a great starting point to start moving up.
I'm so glad you said what you did because as we think about this journey that we're kind of doing with our customers, that maturity curve is a huge part of it, right? We've had spectacular success with customers who are moving up with maturity curve. We've had spectacular not successes with people who are just stuck on, as we say, level one, level zero, of just saying, look, I'm a reactive organization, I'm doing certain things and I don't have it. But more importantly, Andrew, I think in addition to that, they recognize what you said, which is it's change managers, people, process, and tools in that order, right? If you don't have the right people with the right mindset and you start working in the right processes, you don't have to, you won't make any progress until you get those in place. And so jumping to the tools part of it doesn't work necessarily. So I love what
Yep.
you said,
Yep.
uh,
Absolutely agree.
hard earned lessons for all of us, right? So I think that's interesting. So the maturity ladder, as you said, change management, something coming back to yours and mine, business school background. One of the things that I've got more and more sensitized to as part of this whole story is storytelling. Actually, I said the word right. So you can talk about the maturity, you can talk about the strategic objectives, you can start the change management, but effectively telling the services story is also an important aspect of it, right? And I don't know, we've all been taught to teach that or taught to tell that story well, right? In terms of this stuff, is that something that you guys pay attention to at ATS or your background? Yeah.
Yeah, there's certainly um, storytelling or tying all the different benefits together, right? And in this case, it's the life cycle of equipment, right? So maybe less on the storytelling side, but really just stringing together what is, a lot of different offerings, different parts of your business that that can be complicated. Making
Yeah.
that simple, making it understandable, and putting it into terms that help your customer, right? So, is it something we focus on? Absolutely. Um, it's got to make sense. It's got to be understandable, and it's got to be easy for it to help both you internally or your customers.
So, it's actually fascinating because when I think about the conversation we just had, there's three different buckets of things we talked about, right? One is the importance of service and really the experience, the delivering the experience to the customer. Second, we talked about, how all these things come together in the form of the skill and the dynamic range and, the ability to execute and get, a reliable execution, if you may. The third, we talked about the maturity and the common theme amongst everybody is a maturity curve and where they're in the maturity curve.
Hmm.
What I find interesting in all of this stuff is to go back to the second point about dynamic range. It really takes somebody who's thoughtful to kind of think about these various disparate things and tie them together into one whole. So I really appreciate how you were able to kind of make all those different ideas kind of come together. So thank you for those three buckets of ideas, if you may. Now,
Yeah.
you know,
Yep.
sorry, you were going to say.
No. Yeah. I was going to say. I mean, if you don't approach it that way, oftentimes you have a hammer and you're looking for a nail, right? Versus the other way around.
Absolutely.
And that story is a lot harder to tell, and sometimes people just don't want to hear it, right? But if you can really solve a problem, uh, there's plenty of ways to solve it. And so if you can do that in the way that's right for your customer, then that's really what counts.
Absolutely. And it's a fabulous thing to do. So, I always, first of all, Andrew, that is a fantastic conversation. I always like to end my conversation because like you, I'm also podcast buff. I listen to podcasts all the time. And one of my favorites all time guy is a podcast by the name of Guy Raz, who talks about different
Yep.
things. And his favorite question at the end of everything is like, if you were to think about your career arc and journey and everything you've done so far, how much of you do you ascribe to luck and how much of it is skill and, what's your take on things, right?
Yeah. I'll give the answer of it's probably both. And to be more specific, I think the skill is knowing when to go right versus left. Knowing that Darden was a good pick, knowing that Danaher was a good company. Um, I think that's the skill,
Yeah.
but choosing those, not knowing how the story is going to end. So that's where the luck part comes in. Lucky
Yeah.
to have worked for almost all really good bosses, managers, have really good experience, and there's just some luck to that.
Yeah.
But the skill to know, hey, there's something special going on here. I need to pay attention to this. This is where I need to get involved and let it go from there. I'd say it's a little bit of both.
Yeah. No, you're right. I mean, I always think about the choices we make are based on certain educated guesses or certain guess, analysis we does. But at some level, there are things outside of control that kind of take you there, right? You were put into a rotation for services and you happen to like it. And then that led to a journey now for the last 10, 15 years in an area that you love, right? So that was maybe luck was the wrong thing, but there's definitely an element of luck that led you into that particular rotation, right? And
Yep.
you know,
I knew services, there was growth there. I
yeah,
could do math and I could tell there's plenty of opportunity. But luck to,
yeah,
again, be exposed to certain leaders and certain opportunities, and then taking that and going to the next step, right? So
yeah,
a little bit of both, but skill in knowing that there is a lot of opportunity in a number of ways in service.
yeah, absolutely. This is perfect. Well, Andrew, this has been a great conversation.
Yeah.
I certainly thought it was a great way to kind of pull together lots of different things that you've learned over the career and kind of how people like you can advance and grow, and being able to kind of pull that together a really nice interview, a conversation with you has been a great experience today. So thank you very much for that. I appreciate your time. And to
Yep.
our listeners, you're going to be,
Absolutely.
and to our listeners, Andrew is a senior leader at ATS, and you'll get the podcast, and you'll be able to learn more about his story when you listen to it. So, thanks for tuning in today, Andrew. With that, I appreciate your time today, and thanks a lot.
Yep. Thank you, Vivek.